The more you look at this situation in Syria, how things are unfolding, the more you can see the terrifying similarities between what happened in Syria and what happened in Libya. You need to like and share this video right now, because if you know the details, then you would be as terrified for the future of the Syrian people as I am. So of course, many of you guys have seen the videos and the pictures and the headlines of Syrians flooding the streets and celebrating the overthrow of Assad. Now, we're not going to go into the details of whether or not you personally should like Assad, or even whether the Syrian people should or should not like Assad, because personal politics changes from person to person and country to country. However, we do need to question why the hell the United States and the West in general care so much about this one country, and why the reactions in mainstream media and amongst politicians look eerily similar. In fact, they look exactly the same as when Gaddafi was overthrown in Libya. For example, here you see a celebration of the 13th anniversary of the assassination of Muammar Gaddafi. And you see, just like in Syria, Obama said that they had to overthrow Gaddafi to protect civilians. But of course, we know that as we speak, Israel is conducting a ground invasion of Syria, and the US has not condemned them despite having troops there. And the regime the United States has installed in Syria has not responded to the literal military invasion. So it can't be about protecting civilians. And we also know, of course, that NATO and the United States have left Libya out to dry since Gaddafi was overthrown. I mean, there's quite literally open market slavery. They can't handle simple natural disasters without the entire world having to chip in to help them out. So you can probably trust that any narrative that pretends that overthrowing Assad was about protecting civilians in Syria probably isn't true, given that they use the same narrative in Libya and they left Libyans to die. Some of you may not know, but there is no official record of the US being involved in Libya in the 90s and even the majority of Obama's administration. Now, just like in Syria, the United States allegedly, for the majority of the time it was trying to overthrow Assad, was not involved in the actual overthrow. Instead, they worked with the Chadian government, with an anti-Gaddafi force, terrorists, to overthrow Gaddafi. Now, all over Africa, these anti-Gaddafi forces were well known as being terrorists, just like the terrorists that the United States worked with in Syria to help overthrow the Syrian government. And just like the United States worked with one of their NATO allies, in this particular case in Turkey, a neighbor of Syria who has had historic problems with the Syrian government and the Syrian people, the United States worked with the Chadian government, a neighbor of Libya, who has historically had problems with Libya and Gaddafi, principally driven by France and NATO self-interest. And by worked with their neighbors, I mean those neighbors received funding to send terrorist organizations and terrorist groups into those respective countries to help overthrow the governments that NATO wanted out. But it also should be made clear that although we claimed to the public that we were not involved in either of these conflicts for a long time, really until the very end, we were involved in both of those countries, and we were merely lying. And we used terrorism as the excuse in order to be there without any consequences. That way, it wouldn't look like we were expending resources to overthrow a government without the approval of the governing bodies in the international community. Now, just like in Syria, because the United States didn't know exactly how to codify or prove that Assad was this brutal dictator who needed to be overthrown with the support of the international community, they just said that everybody was fighting because it was a civil war and half the country hated Assad. Just like they wanted to convince you that half of the country hated Gaddafi. I can't stress enough, just because part of a country does not like the president doesn't mean that you should overthrow the government. Because if that was the case, the United States would have had multiple administrations overthrown dozens of times over. And that's not even including how many congressmen would be ripped out of their seats if it was left up to the American people and their approval rating to decide whether or not we should overthrow somebody. But I digress. Even though NATO powers, and specifically the United States, wanted to convince you that he was an internationally despised figure to justify his overthrow, the reality is, he was the elected chairman of the African Union right before they assassinated him. Now, although Assad isn't running the United Nations, Syria is and has been officially a part of the United Nations for decades. And between him and his father, there were very few complaints on the way Syria had been ran. In fact, Nancy Pelosi even went on a visit to Syria and bragged about how well it was being ran. while Assad was the president. In addition to that, Assad won 95% of the vote in their elections. And although the West called those elections fraudulent, they provided zero proof. So my point is, just like Gaddafi, Assad had what we in the international community call a mandate. And normally the reason that people like that win with such a large margin is because of their willingness to stand up to the Western Empire as they're trying to rob them of their resources. So although you'll see a lot of celebration by the mainstream media once again, you'll see a lot of celebration on social media about overthrowing Assad, what you won't see is anyone of the mainstream asking, well, what comes next? Because they don't want you thinking about that. But I can tell you what comes next. Just look at what happened in Libya. The goal wasn't to protect the Libyan people or save the Libyan people. The goal was to destroy and destabilize a country that is ridiculously rich in resources and remove their leader so that they can never unite and use those resources in a way that would contradict the interests of the West. Which is why the West and the current regime in Syria is allowing Israel to destroy everything, and no one's asking why. But I just gave you the answer. It's because Syria is a country that is rich in resources and is a threat to the West because of it. And therefore, the goal isn't to save the Syrian people. It's to destabilize the country, remove their legitimate leadership, and put them in a situation where they can never fight back in a way that would challenge Western imperialism and their interests ever again. If you want to understand what's happening in Syria right now and why things look so discombobulated and what the goals of the West are, just look at Libya and you have your answer.